Hello everybody, it's Paul with reporting live from my sofa, and welcome back to my channel, and welcome to my channel if it is your first time. Now, if you follow my channel, you follow my stuff, last week I dropped part 1 of the Jeffrey MacDonald case. Some of y'all might know it better as the Fatal Vision true crime novel and movie that went along with it. This was back in 1970. So, that being said, welcome to part 2. Now, I'm going to go ahead and drop a card up here to the first video that I did if you want to go back and check that out and just see what it's all about if you're unfamiliar with the case. But I felt like the next step that we needed to take in the series was going down the rabbit hole of Helena Stoeckly. She was such an integral part of this case for better or worse, and there's so much information about her testimony, about her stories. I mean, it just goes on and on throughout the years until her untimely death. And so that being said, I am not claiming that this is the end-all, be-all information bio on Helena. I absolutely welcome y'all to please go down the rabbit hole. I mean, you can literally unearth one stone and spend 5 hours under it. So do that. Come to the comment section. Come to the live chat. Let's discuss it. There's so much to go on. She just literally kind of just is what makes this case so bizarre and so fascinating. So that being said, let's go. So I want to cover just some basic background information on Helena. She was born on June 7th in 1952, and she actually died in South Carolina on January 14th, 1983, and she was only 30 years old when she died, so she was very young. It was very soon, very untimely, and she's actually buried here in Fayetteville, North Carolina. So she did have one child in her lifetime, and she kind of what ended up her entry into this case. She had moved out of her house at a very early age, kind of like mid to late teens. And she says she kind of did it to get away from like her father's authority. He was retired from the service, and she became very heavily involved with drugs in the drug scene, and that kind of is what would propel her into this case. And she basically became involved in this case a couple of days after it took place. Almost immediately her name was involved, and so she just ended up getting wrapped up in this. And basically, to me, her involvement in the case spanned the rest of her life, and that's where we're going to begin this story at. Okay, so let's go ahead and just jump right to the night of the murders. Now, on the night of the murders, the first MP that responded to the MacDonald house, his name was Kenneth Micah, and he said that on the way there, he spotted a woman several blocks from MacDonald's house, and she was wearing like a floppy hat, she had light-colored hair, and she was standing on a street corner. And he said that if he hadn't been headed to an emergency call, that he would have stopped and questioned her and found out what she was doing, because this was just so bizarre to see a woman standing on the street corner at this hour in this part of town. But he said he didn't stop because it was, obviously an emergency he was going to. And he did say once he got to the MacDonald house, he notified a superior of, his findings, and was essentially told, don't follow up, just stay on scene. And so he followed orders. Now, once they got in there and, MacDonald started talking and his story coming out, he essentially was saying that 4 people attacked my family. They were hippies. And he said that one of them was a black guy that had an army jacket with sergeant stripes. There was also 2 white males. And then there was a white woman with like a floppy hat, some go-go boots, a candle. And that she basically stayed in the background and chanted something along the lines of "acid is groovy, kill the pigs." And this description that he gave would be the catalyst for the bizarre tale that pulls in Helena Stoeckly and really is still kind of untold. Now, for this next part, I'm going to go over some of Detective Beasley's testimony from the trial, and real quickly, we're going to delve more into who he is and his relationship to Helena, but she worked as a confidential informant for him there in Fayetteville. And so, with that being said, let's just jump to about 24 hours after the murders to the early morning of February 18th, 1970. Now, when Detective Beasley heard this description of the suspects, as well as the saying "acid is groovy, kill the pigs," he felt like it matched Helena in something that she might say. And so he claims that he stalked her apartment out, her last known whereabouts, and around 4 a.m.-ish on the morning of the 18th, she returned in a blue convertible type car, and she was with a black male and about 3 other white guys. and he said that he questioned her about the murders then and there, and that she had heard of them, and he said that he point blank asked her if she was involved, and on the stand he would let her say that she said, in my mind it seems that I saw this thing happen. I was heavy on mescaline. And now mescaline's a basically hallucinogenic drug. Now he claims that he detained her and her friends in the driveway for about an hour, and that he contacted his dispatch to contact the CID investigators because the Army was handling this investigation, so it was technically like out of his jurisdiction. But he wanted to let them know about these suspects, that he had them, and he claims that they never showed up. And so he said that he knew, since he knew Helena, he knew he could find her again. He really wasn't worried about it. But the men that he encountered with her, he basically took their information down. And he said that later on the stand, he said that he never saw the men again, that their names were in a file, and that the file was lost when it came down time to pull all this stuff out. And so they just kind of disappeared. And now within 2 weeks of this interaction in the driveway, Helena did move to Nashville. And Detective Beasley would actually go to Nashville later on with another detective to visit her and question her again. And after that visit, he said that he felt like she was either involved in the murders or was simply convinced in her own mind that she was involved in the murders. And that's a theme that we're going to see here as we go on. And now let's kind of just pause for a second. And Beasley and Stokley, they have a very interesting relationship, and we should probably delve into that just a little bit. So let's take a look at that. Like I said, Helena worked for Beasley as an informant. And he says that she was the best, and that she brought him over 500 arrests. And he says she was always reliable, she was always on time. He said that if she said drugs would be somewhere, they were there. So he trusted her. And she said that she considered him to be like a friend. So there are some odd things that I found with Beasley. And remember how I stated just a minute ago that, he said the CID never showed up and he had to let the suspects go? Well, even when on the stand in trial, the judge at a bench conference said that he felt like Beasley harbored some kind of ill feelings towards the CID. And, we all know that there can be like these hierarchy issues between different agencies. And now I can see the justifiable ill feelings if they were just authentically because the CID, let the suspects go. And I can appreciate that, there's, I don't know how this works with the laws and stuff, but that he can only detain them for so long. But something just feels like dramatic about his statement of just having to let them go. Because I just feel like, okay, some completely heinous murder like this happens, and here you are with this very trusted informant. You feel like all these people are the suspects, and granted, he's like, I can find her again, but these guys, I just can't find them again, and they didn't call back, so, they had to go. I mean, again, it feels dramatic, and I just feel like, is there not something you could have done, maybe? I mean, I don't know. So, I also find it interesting that he claims that he wrote these guys' names down, and that particular file was lost and never seen from again, and he never heard or saw these guys again. So part of me was just kind of going down this little avenue of, did he make that up? Was there some kind of spitefulness going on, and he just either, over dramatized the whole situation or just made it up, or is he just telling the truth and is like, look, this is what happened, they dropped the ball and these guys disappeared? But again, something just didn't set right with me about it. So some of my thoughts on the whole situation are, informant relationships are so particular, and she sounds like she was really close with Beasley. And now I'm not trying to sit here and say that they had a relationship or anything like that. I mean, I don't know if they did or did not. My assumption is they did not. But a side perk to informant relationships is that a lot of times a blind eye is turned to what the informant is doing. And Helena does state that this was her case a lot of times, that she got herself out of trouble by using this method, by turning people in. And so all these little webs that are woven with this relationship between them, it just, to me, takes their credibility issue down, hers as well as his. It makes me kind of sit here and just question everybody's motivations in that. So that being said, now that we have some backstory on her, on the night of the crimes, how she got involved in it, we are going to take a time travel to the civilian trial in 1979, and we're going to start looking over some of the testimony, because this is where kind of the story unfolds through what people are saying, and it gets very interesting. So in 1979, at the trial, Helena's questioned on the stand by the defense attorney Segal and the state prosecutor Blackburn. And I'm guessing the defense saw that they had this total bombshell witness with her, and that it was just going to completely, throw all this doubt off of MacDonald, and the absolute opposite took place. Now, there was a ton of evidence and testimony. And so, I mean, again, this is one of those parts, and I'm just like, you could spend, a week going over this. But I'm just going to kind of go through it and cover what I consider to be the highlighted points so that we can just get to it. Now, before I get started, let's actually cover the day before the trial. So, Helena, as well as several witnesses, she's flown in from Nashville. Remember that she had moved to Nashville a couple of weeks after this murder took place. And so all these witnesses and stuff were gathered that were essentially going to testify about conversations they had had with her, because she had talked to all these different people about the murders and all this stuff. And so, they had put this whole string line of story together. So just kind of go into this next segment here with that knowledge. Now, the motivation, obviously, for the defense team is to bring light to the fact that Helena was part of these murders. She knows who did it. They want to take the blame away from Jeffrey MacDonald. Obviously, it's their client. So, right off from the beginning, it's established that at this point in time, Helena hasn't had a permanent address for about a month. Prior to that, she had been living in a quarter house in Columbia, South Carolina, that she was intended to help people with addictions and kind of get their footing back in life and get jobs and stuff. And she did admit to being addicted to heroin during the period of 69 to 70, so when these murders took place. And then there's this long line of questions about drug use and all the different drugs she used, which essentially just leads up to this conversation about acid, which she readily admits that she used very heavily. And, then he questions her about her knowledge of Fort Bragg and her access to it. Remember, her dad was a retired Army colonel. He questioned her about her involvement in witchcraft and the occult. And he had her describe some rituals and how candles were used. He even discusses her use of the word pig and how it referred to people of the establishment and, police officers and things of that nature. So the defense is clearly building this foundation that includes all the different aspects of what MacDonald said took place. And, the 4 hippies broke into his home, the word pig was used, candles were there, the whole 9 yards. So, with this established, they then go to the morning of February 17th, the murders, essentially, with Helena on the stand. And she says that the only thing she remembers of that night is she was hanging out with her boyfriend, Greg Mitchell, in their driveway around midnight. She said that Greg left her with a hit of mescaline, and she said the next thing she remembers is returning home around 4:35. And so then what proceeds for the rest, just pages and pages of testimony, is it comes to a complete shock to the defense. It doesn't matter what he says, she does not remember. She goes blank on everything. And every bit of evidence he presents to her, the conversations that she had in the past, conversations that she had the day before, she says she has no memory of. And this essentially makes her completely unreliable. And any hopes the defense had and using her as a red herring or whatever, they're out the door. So let's go into a wee bit more detail about some of the details of her sudden amnesia. Now, because of her apparent lack of memory, the line of witnesses that were supposed to testify about the conversation, that's all kind of brought into question. And now, remember, she had moved to Nashville a couple of weeks after the murders took place. And she said that she did this because of police harassment and her involvement with the case, and her family's name was getting run through the mud. So she just wanted to skip town. So the defense flew in several of these associates from Nashville, some of her neighbors and stuff like that. And they were going to testify to these conversations that she essentially had. And we're going to get more into depth with those in just a minute. But let's just go over some of the testimony again, because again, this part's so good about this case. So when Segal brings up that people from Nashville that Stokley knew and apparently had conversations with about the murders, again, she would just say well, I remembered the people and, I remember that stuff like that coming up, but I don't remember the contents of the conversations. No, I don't have any details. And so he reminds her that just the day before, several of her acquaintances from Nashville, and her and him, they had all gone over this stuff, and now she has just seemingly forgotten all of this information. And so he is growing frustrated, obviously, because his whole thing is just riding on this, and it's crumbling before his eyes. And he finally brings photos of the victims out and shows her, and in response to like one of her comments that she had made before about recognizing Colette and the MacDonald children, that now on the stand she's like, well, I could have seen these girls anywhere really. And, Colette, maybe I saw her on base somewhere. Maybe I saw her around town, I mean, that's probably where I recognize them from. Really, reading the testimony, she has a reasonable excuse for everything. I mean, there's nothing that's completely outlandish except for her total lack of memory. That's a little suspect. And so Mr. Segal, he asked her several direct questions about statements that she made allegedly to him just the day before. And again, she just is like, what? Huh? What statements? So he pulls out another picture. And now this is another point of interest in this case with this. There's a picture of a hobby horse, and it was stated at one point that she mentioned a hobby horse and that it was broken. It was in one of the girls' rooms. And this is kind of one of those things that they were like, well, only the, person, how would anybody know this? So, but on the stand and looking at it, she's like, oh, well, you can look at this picture. I thought that it was broken because of, this picture right here, and not because of my memory or anything. And eventually this is pointed out that maybe one of these pictures was put out into the press or whatever. So again, it's this reasonable type situation that she's saying something like this, and it's completely frustrating Segal. And he calls a bench conference with the judge, so he and Blackburn, the state, go up to the court, go up to the bench, and Segal tells the judge, look, just the day before, Helena said she was in the MacDonald's house. She said she remembers holding a candle. She remembers seeing a man's body on the floor. She said she remembered riding the rocking horse in Kristen MacDonald's room and that it was broken. She had also stated that she remembered standing on the corner near the MacDonald house when she was spotted by the MPs on their way to the house. But also during the same, bench conference, Blackburn, the state, says, well, when we met with her, she's basically repeating all the same stuff. Like, she didn't remember any of this stuff. Like, this is nothing new. This testimony is nothing new to us. So, at this point, Segal's trying to get, he's like, I forget what exactly it's called, but there's something you can do when somebody just completely takes you off guard on the stand. And the judge isn't having it. And so the judge actually finally gets to the point of questioning her himself on some things. And again, she just continues on with this total reasonable excuses for everything, lack of memory, so on and so forth. And then it's time for her to be cross-examined by the state. So when Blackburn cross-examines her, the feel of the testimony, it just comes across easier. He establishes that she does remember standing in the driveway talking to her friend Greg Mitchell. He established that she wasn't wearing the blonde wig at that time because Greg didn't like it. And I remember Greg was her boyfriend. He establishes that she has no memory of ever being at the MacDonald's house. And he directly asked her if she participated in the killings, and she said no. He asked her the same questions for each family member. Did you kill them? And she says no to all of it. And then he asked her about the blonde wig and why she got rid of it. Now, she never denied that she had the floppy hat and all that kind of stuff. These were pretty common items. This wasn't like, these were not completely rare things to see. Hippie culture, floppy hat, white go-go boots. This is not anything that was, completely abnormal. And with the blonde wig, she says that she got rid of it because she was being harassed so much about the murders that she wanted to get rid of anything that might make it look like she had anything to do with it. And again, it seems a little bit like, ooh, that's a little sketchy. But on the same note, there also just seems to be this almost relaxed thing about it, because I'm just like, I just feel like, at that point in time, if something if she wasn't already arrested or something of this nature, it was almost like she was coming across as, well, I don't have anything to hide, and y'all are really bugging me, and everybody's coming after me, and I have this wig that everybody's claiming I wore, so let's just get rid of it. Let's just solve the problem and get rid of it. So it does seem reasonable to me, but at the same time, it seems a little bit suspect, but maybe more reasonable than suspect. And so overall, if my opinion is her answers on cross-examination with the state, just make it seem pointless that she even testified for the defense. I mean, it just seems like a complete waste of time, and like she was more of the state's witness. So he basically just completely takes all this testimony down on the cross-examination. Okay, so remember all the acquaintances from Nashville that she had allegedly spoken with in the past about the murders, and now all of a sudden forgot? Well, several of those witnesses were going to be called after her. But because of the surprise testimony and whatnot, they ended up testifying on voir dire. I'm probably mispronouncing that, so bear with me, I apologize. But basically in the absence of jury and alternates. And now what I want to do is I want to go through their testimony very briefly, because again, this was another huge rabbit hole that if you are interested, I encourage you to go, read all of it, because it is interesting. But I just kind of want to talk about each of their testimony a little bit, because I do think that it paints a picture of her mental, emotional, and spiritual state during this time. So the first witness we're going to discuss, her name is Jane. I'm going to try and pronounce her last name here, but bear with me. It's Siluex. I'm mispronouncing that. I'm sorry. So we'll call her Jane S. to make it simple for Paul. So she lived across the street from Helena in Nashville, and when the defense questioned her about having conversations about the murder, she had a little story to tell. And she basically said that one day she went across the street to check on Helena because she hadn't seen her and she had been sick for several days, and she just wanted to do like a welfare check. And now it should also be known that Jane, she was not familiar with drugs or drug culture, so recognizing somebody like being in withdrawal, she just didn't know anything about that. But she said that Helena was very sick, and she basically at that point was like, look, why don't you move back home, let your family take care of you, you're sick, obviously there's some stuff going on. And at this point in time, Helena said that she couldn't go back home because she was involved in some murders. And Jane was basically like, clutch my pearls, I don't know what to do. She said, this is like, oh my goodness gracious moment. And she continued on, and she said that basically Helena said that because of her drug abuse that she didn't know whether she had or hadn't been at the house that night, but that she does remember being with 3 boys that she didn't know, and she stated that she was with them for drugs. And so she just had this murky memory. And then when the neighbor said that she eventually called the FBI to report this information because it bothered her so badly, because she believed her, and basically she got nowhere with the FBI. And she said also during this conversation with Helena that Helena said that basically when she came to and was standing in the rain that she had all this blood on her hands, which, I mean, obviously that's horrible. But again, to me, this is very important because this starts the beginning process of Helena stating, I don't know if I was there or not. So this is a key element moving forward here. So let's return to Detective Beasley momentarily. Now, in addition to the testimony that we covered earlier in regards to him saying that he detained Helena and her friends in the driveway, he also stated during this testimony that he stopped by her place right before she left Fayetteville when the funeral for the MacDonalds was taking place. And he states that she had a whole bunch of wreaths in the front yard and one on the front door. And when he, basically went to talk to her or whatever, she said that, she was in mourning and she was kind of like dressed in black, and it just, seemed kind of odd to her. And she said that she was in mourning for the murders. And now when confronted about this on the stand, when Helena was confronted about it, she said that there was a nearby flower shop that always threw flowers out, and that they would always pick these flowers up and take them home, and it just so happened that they had thrown out these kind of funeral-looking wreaths. And so that's just what she happened to have that time. And of course, that she didn't remember the conversation at that point. So again, you kind of see this going back and forth here on her things and whatnot. So now, when Blackburn cross-examined Beasley, he referred back to a statement that Beasley had given at some point, which was essentially like a conclusion statement after meeting with her a year later in Nashville to talk to her. And I'm going to read the statement verbatim. That this is what he gave. It is my conviction that she is involved in the MacDonald case, or at least thinks she is, or that she is doing this just to get all the attention she possibly can. Now, he also claims that at some point she gave him the wig and the floppy hat and then later asked for it back and apparently disposed of them. So here's just a couple of things here to right off the bat. Now, his statement saying here, again, this is another theme that we keep seeing come up. Either she's convinced that she's convinced herself that she's there, or she was really there. And this really brings into conversation when someone does this, I mean, how do you tell the difference if, they were lying or not? The wig and the floppy hat, the fact that he had that and then gave it back, something doesn't add up to me about that. The same way that he's saying, oh, I had these suspects, but I had to let them go. Well, at this point, especially, it's been a couple of weeks. Now, remember, the murders happened within a couple of weeks she was gone. So this was, a short time span. If she gave you these items, I mean, why would you give them back? I mean, it doesn't make sense to me. Anyways, we'll continue on. At the end of all of this kind of testimony, basically none of it will be included in front of a jury because she just showed to be completely unreliable. And again, this wasn't her trial. This was Jeffrey MacDonald's trial. And so as you can see through all this kind of testimony, it can easily turn into the Helena Stoeckly trial just based on is she lying or not. So I'm just curious with this right here, like, what do y'all think? Like, do you think the wreaths part was dramatic? Again, like, with that part right there, let's take what she's saying verbatim. She's saying, oh, there's a flower shop. This seems totally reasonable. That throws flowers out and there just happen to be these wreaths. The other side, if the officer's telling the truth, why would you, if you're suspected of murders, put wreaths out and wear black and tell an officer that you're mourning for the murders? I mean, so much of it doesn't make sense. So, I don't know. I'm curious what y'all think about that aspect. So just drop some stuff in the comments and let's continue. Now, real quick, let's also explore the testimony because this is a good time to, very briefly, of Bill Posey. Now, he was Helena's neighbor in Fayetteville. And so he testified that on the night the crimes were around 4 a.m., that he saw her pull up in a blue Mustang. She was in the car with some guys. He confirmed that she wore a hat similar to the suspect, the floppy hat. She had white boots on. And so later on, he said that once he learned that the police were questioning her and all this, that he was essentially like, well, look, I saw you come home. I'm your alibi. Let me know. I can help you. And that this kind of scared her off for whatever reason. She didn't really have much to do with him after that. Like, this kind of just freaked her out for some reason. So I just thought that was an interesting tidbit to throw in there. So let's continue on with Nashville people. So James Gaddis, now he is a police officer, or was a police officer in Tennessee. And I felt like the way Gaddis and Helena met was very interesting. He said that he was patrolling her neighborhood one day and she flagged him down. And she told him that she wanted to give him information about drugs being sold in the area and about a police officer that was selling drugs to children. And he said that after a few days of talking with her about the police officer selling drugs and whatnot, that she asked him to find out if she was still wanted for questioning in the MacDonald murder. And that during that time that she basically said that she felt like, because of the description of the female's clothes, matching hers, that she felt like she had been there at these murders. And so again, I just kind of feel like it's interesting here that, wherever she goes, she's in Nashville, she flags this cop down, she's trying to strike up a relationship, kind of with Beasley to inform. I just feel like this can be a sign of, like, drug paranoia. And if she's having this type of stuff go on where she's getting strung out, she gets paranoid, she flags the cop down, let me get them information, about, not the murders even, but just, drug information, let me turn people in, whatever. I just find it interesting. I just find it interesting that she continually strikes these relationships up like this. And I find it interesting the context of, what is she aiming to get out of it besides just getting out of trouble. So anyways, I digress here. Now, so the officer said, again, during these meetings, he felt like she would be on drugs at some times, other times not. He said that she talked to him about the murders on several occasions, saying, at times she thought she had been there, that she was on LSD. Other times she would say that she knew who did it. And so, again, just more of this testimony of, the back and forth, and maybe I did. And again, the whole aspect of, oh, because of the female's clothes description, I feel like maybe it was me. You know, an idea being put into her head. And I think what's coming to light more and more is that she's just so unsure of what she did that I think that there's, on one hand, I don't know what I was doing, but everyone says I was doing this. And then the other hand, it's like, well, is she getting something out of this, you know, that we're not seeing here? So let's continue. So Robert Brisentine Jr., he was the CID polygraph examiner, and he interviewed her on the 24th and the 23rd of April in 1971 in Nashville, Tennessee. And she told him so many things. So on that first interview, he said that she stated she didn't remember what happened during those nights of the murders. Kind of the same story. But that for months after the murders took place, that she felt like she was present at the MacDonald's home that night. And that leading up to the murders, that she had heard the hippie population was angry with Dr. MacDonald because he wouldn't prescribe methadone for the addiction to for their addiction to drugs, and this had just caused some bad feelings. So later she would retract that statement. Now, at one point, she said she told him that she delivered drugs to Castle Drive to an officer named Bob. Castle Drive is the house where the MacDonald's home was. Now, she also stated in these interviews that she had bizarre dreams about the murders, and that also that she would reveal the name of the offenders who killed the family if immunity was provided to her. So, but when she came in the following day, again, her story changed. This is like kind of typical for her at this point. She told him that she talked too much and that she really didn't know the offenders, but just suspected some people of it. And, you know, basically, he suspected, or he said that she was under the influence of drugs the first day that he was interviewing her. That was his feeling. And, but she did end up naming some suspects, and so we're going to go into those very briefly. So the first suspect was Don Harris, and essentially this was just an associate, and he said that he had to leave Fayetteville because he couldn't find an alibi for the night of the murders. Another one was Bruce Fowler. Now, he was the owner of the blue Mustang that she was riding around in, the passenger of the night of the murders. Then there was his wife, Janice, and she was a go-go dancer in Fayetteville during that time. She also named Joe Kelly. He was a soldier that was assigned to medical holding detachment at Womack Army Hospital in Fort Bragg, and he was a black guy. There's another black guy that she named. His name was Eddie, and she claimed that he introduced her to heroin. And now when Bernstein was asked if he felt like these people were really associated with the crime, he said that he interviewed most of them, and he didn't feel they were involved. And he did not interview Don Harris, so he really couldn't say about, you know, what his testimony or feeling was on that, obviously. But he said that overall he felt like her testimony was kind of all over the place and that he personally didn't really believe her. However, her polygraph would say something a little bit different, and we'll get into that in just a second. Now, before we get into the polygraphs, let's finish up talking about a couple of witnesses real quick. Now, the first was Charles Edward Underhill, and he told a story about a time in Nashville that he went over to her house, and again, she was probably sick and all this type of stuff, but he said that she was hysterical, and she was saying things like, they killed two children, and so eventually he had to go get Jane, the neighbor who we discussed earlier, who also testified, and another friend to kind of console her and pull her out of this. So you see how all these little things happen with the neighbors and people that aren't familiar. You know, all these little blurbs of confessions are put out there, or things that just make you say, what? Okay, so remember we discussed the interviews with Robert Brisentine on the 23rd and 24th of April. Now, I'm about to read his official statement about the polygraphs. Now, remember, he was the CID polygraph examiner. And I'm just going to read them verbatim, so I'm just going to look over here for a minute. Based on the polygraph examination conducted on 24 April 2017, it is concluded that Miss Stokley is convinced in her mind that she knows the identity of those persons who killed Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen MacDonald. It is further concluded that Miss Stokley is convinced in her mind that she was physically present when the three members of the MacDonald family were killed. No admissions were made by Miss Stokley in post-test interrogation. No abnormal physiological responses were noted in the polygraph tracings. However, due to Miss Stokley's admitted confused state of mind and her excessive drug use during and immediately following the homicides in question, a conclusion cannot be reached as to whether she in fact knows who perpetuated the homicides or whether in fact she was present at the scene of the murders. Now, I find this very, very interesting, and this completely brings up the topic of the reliability issue with polygraphs. Now, again, this was a while ago, so they were probably looked at as different. I mean, I can't speak to how they were viewed in the court of law then. I mean, nowadays, like we know, they're not used in court. To me, I view polygraphs as like a jumping off point that can kind of separate, like, do we need to go down the avenue with this person or not? But that being said, I don't believe in polygraphs. I just don't. I don't think that they're reliable, and that's that. So, I mean, absolutely drop your comments. Let me know what you think. I'm very curious to hear. And now also, I think that this part's interesting with this. So if someone's convinced that they did something, so like Helena in this case, like let's say, and let's take out if she did or not, let's say she's convinced that she did it. So she passes test saying, yeah, I mean, you were there, like judging from this, you know, you were there. But what if they were convinced that they didn't do it when they really did? Does that make sense? So what if she was there and she had killed all these people, but in her mind she had convinced herself, I haven't done it, so she can pass the test. So that's just where I get very curious, you know, about the polygraph situation. So anyways, let me know what you think, and let's continue. Now, Mr. Breinstein conducted several other polygraphs, and we're just going to go over the quickly a few of them that I feel are most important and the results of them. So we're just going to talk about Janice Fowler, Bruce Fowler, and Greg Mitchells. Now remember, Janice and Bruce was the owner of the blue Mustang, and Janice was his wife, and Greg was Helena's boyfriend. Again, all people that Helena has pointed the finger to at some point in time and said they're, you know, did it, guilty. So the questions that were asked, we're just going to go over the three relevant ones on these questions because, I mean, it's a long polygraph. Did you cut or strike any member of the MacDonald family? Did you cut or strike any member of the MacDonald family at Fort Bragg, North Carolina? And were you physically present when any member of the MacDonald family was cut or struck? Now, again, each of these people answered no to all of the questions, and no deception or abnormalities were detected in the polygraph. So this is another perplexing aspect. You know, if we believe that Helena is telling the truth, then why are these people able to pass their test, which essentially clears them of the crime, obviously, but then also kind of clears her and puts her testimony into question. So, and again, like I just said, polygraphs, I'm not there with them, I'm not feeling them, so I get all that, but I find it very interesting. And this just is kind of like another nail in the coffin where her testimony is just like, you know, what? It's not that reliable. So the end result, of course, in this trial is that MacDonald was found guilty, sentenced to 3 life sentences, and that's that. But that is far from where the story ends. So what we're going to do now is we're going to flash forward a little bit to May 21st, 1982. And this is, in my opinion, the wildest turn the story of Helena Stoeckly has taken. By far, it takes the cake. And so let's get right into it. So Stoeckly, on May 21st, 1982, she was interviewed by Ted Gunderson and Detective Beasley in a televised interview. And what I'm going to do, because literally so much went on in this interview, I'm just going to kind of read through points here. So some of them might jump around a little bit, so take this more as like a bullet point type list of things that were covered in this very interesting interview. So now, before we start, Gunderson, he was a retired FBI special agent, and he was hired by the defense team to be one of their investigators, and Beasley got involved with this. So when Helena was asked why she changed her story so many times over the years, she said that because she was involved in a satanic cult at the time of the murders. And basically, they were like, well, why are you coming forward at this point? And she is, at this interview, she's pregnant. And so she says that anyone that knows anything about witchcraft knows that the first child, it will be sacrificed, and that she's received these kind of threats, and that her family's received threats. And she's also wanted to avoid going to prison in the past. And at the time of this interview, she feels like the statute of limitations has run out on that. Then she also claims that she broke into MacDonald's house 3 weeks prior to steal money for drugs. And she also claims that the first time that she agreed to do that polygraph, it was because she was busted for drugs and was told that if she did the polygraph, that the charges would be dropped. Now, this last claim right here, I think is very interesting. And so if we take what came from her mouth verbatim, this is how I think a lot of these things go. So she agrees to do the polygraph to get out of trouble for something. That's not really disclosed or told or put out there or whatever at the time. Because essentially it's, we're doing you a favor. Somehow she manages to pass this polygraph, not pass in a good way, but pass in a, you know about these murders way, which could simply be just simply because she's being honest that I don't know what I was doing, but I believe it. So, and I think probably a lot of this stuff went on in this case with her that was not brought to the light, which was, well, hey, we'll do blank for you if you do this. And so it probably wasn't necessarily like, we're going to pay you $500, but it could have been something as simple as, hey, we're going to put you up in a hotel room for a week while you're homeless to testify. Okay, sign me up. So that part was very interesting to me. So let's continue with some of the other stuff that she said. Now, she says that the occult decided on MacDonald's house because he wasn't willing to work with addicts. And basically he had tried to turn one of the addicts over when they came into the hospital to authorities on the base. So, and that was something that she had mentioned before. And so interesting that she circles back to this. Now, she goes into this interview into intricate detail about how the cults work. And she says that ultimately she was a part of like a group of 13 people that had access to what she called closed meetings. And this is where the MacDonald murders were not really planned, but kind of something was decided that would be done at the MacDonald's house to get back. Now, she also says that she essentially got involved in black witchcraft, which is the evil witchcraft, just to have access to drugs because apparently all these people were doing drugs. And she admits that while she worked for the police for Beasley, that this was to distract away from her own crimes with drugs. Now, again, he questions her why she is coming forward, and she basically says it's a conscious thing, in addition to the other reasons that she gave. She makes sure to say that she hasn't been coerced or promised anything monetary, which to me, the amount of times that she went over that and was so like, I'm not being promised anything, it just felt very awkward and fake to me, and almost like one of those where they all wanted to make sure that that was there. So now Gunderford states that he and Beasley plan on talking to top officials to seek immunity for her so that she will name the names and come forward with all of the information because she claims to be holding back. Because basically during this interview, when they would ask her about a specific name or anything really specific, she would withhold it and basically say, I don't want to for fear of, getting harmed by this cult, or for prosecution reasons. So, and seeking immunity is something she always kind of circles back around to, but for some reason nobody is ever willing to admit to that. So, excuse me. Now, she also says in the night of the murders, when they first entered the house, that the men were arguing with MacDonald about getting some speed from him. And then she describes herself as wearing the floppy hat, the white boots, a black vest, carrying a candle so that they could see better. She describes an intricate scene of an argument and a fight. And she says that the members of the cult went into Colette's room and began beating on her and tried to take blood from her for a ritual. And now at times, the interviewer Gunderson, he corrects her at times. And for instance, so when they're discussing the time that Beasley detained her, she said, oh, he detained us for like 20 minutes. And then Gunderson says, well, Beasley says it was more like an hour and 15 minutes. Could it have been longer? And she responds, well, yes, the first time he detained me was for 20 minutes, but then I had to go back and talk to the group and settle them down. So she kind of backtracks. And so right there, honestly, that kind of stuff, it loses me. The interview felt like it was completely staged by Gunderson and Beasley. They were just ticking off all the points that they needed to. Her thing where she's describing the hat and the boots, and you got to remember, at this time, she's had years to get this information. While she can sit here and say all day long, nobody's told me this info or anything, well, she's already gone through a trial. I mean, it's a done thing. So she's had all this time to sit here and kind of know this information to add points to the story. And again, what is her reasoning for this? I mean, she claims it's her conscience. And I hate to sit here because maybe she did do this. Maybe she was blacked out and went along with these murders and did want to help and feels like she knows something. But I also just feel like things just aren't adding up with it, and they're not adding up with the people that are surrounding her with it either. Now, several months after making this confession to Gunderson, FBI agents reported that Stokley was encouraged by Gunderson to talk about a cult, and that she was of the opinion that the mention of cult activities in her statement was primarily Gunderson's idea and not hers. So, I mean, again, right there, you just have to question all of the above. So now remember that this interview took place in 1981, and Stokley died just a couple of years later in 1983. And again, she was age 30, very young. So now all that's basically left are the words that she left. You know, this testimony, her experience, other people's experience of her. He said, she said. And so people are just raking over it, trying to find nuggets of truth. Because obviously, for MacDonald and his crew, if they can prove this, especially now that she's gone, you know, this is reasonable doubt. So now, another interesting twist and turn in this case that happens years after she is deceased is the following. So a former marshal, Jimmy Britt, he said in sworn statements in 2005 that Helena told him that she was at MacDonald's home at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, the February night that his family was murdered. She said that, and he said that this confession took place when he was driving her from South Carolina in 1979 to testify at the MacDonald's murder trial in Raleigh. Like, he claimed that he was the one that had to transport her and that she confesses to him. But he also said that he witnessed Blackburn essentially threaten her and tell her that if you get on the stand and say that you've been in the house or, you know, you say all these things, I'm going to charge you with murder. And so that's why she got up there and said, oh, I forget all this stuff and I don't remember, and yada, yada, yada. And the whole thing fell apart. Now, in September 2012, in Wilmington, at North Carolina, at a hearing, Britt's fellow marshals testified that other marshals were the ones that transported Stokley, and they portrayed Britt as a fabulist and troublemaker with a drinking problem. So, the prosecutors did produce law enforcement documents showing that Britt was not one of those two marshals who drove Stokley that day, and of course, he has since passed away. So, all we have left is what he said. And again, he said, she said, so the evidence would look like he made this up for some reason. And there seems to be a lot of that in this case, of people attaching themselves to it and either making dramatic claims, making completely false claims, or on the other side, everyone's telling the truth, and this guy has been framed. So, but to round it back to Helena, I mean, this is kind of where I'm going to trail off with her story on this, because again, it's the time of this recording is 2019. Things were still going on with this, and a lot of it was tied to his MacDonald side of the case, essentially just trying to pick things apart with her testimony and her pointing the finger at everybody and implicating her in these murders, obviously to get a new trial and to get out. As I stated before, this is not an exhaustive tell-all on Helena. Again, with each twist of this case, as you can see just from what I've gone over and her testimony, I mean, it can be viewed completely differently. And with each person she implicated, there's an entirely new pathway to go down. And even like her boyfriend, Greg Mitchell, apparently, allegedly confessed to the crimes a couple of times. So then why did he pass his polygraph? You know, there's just, this case is just filled with these things. So, you know, whether it's the prosecution or the defense, I think each side has a purpose. And, you know, obviously the defense is to get MacDonald out of prison, and the state's is to keep him in prison. And I feel like there's also, in this case, a lot that's not being said about numerous people's motivations, such as Gunderson, Beasley. You know, a lot of these people, if they're being paid by the defense to even investigate, they're going to be a little biased. And it just seems very interesting to me how many people come forward that are then essentially what we see proven to not be that truthful. So for me, at the end of the day, I believe that Helena truly believed that she was there because she had no clue where she was at. I think that because other people immediately came in and gave her information, whether it be just in passing, I don't think she was a stupid woman. I don't think she was so burnt out that, because she was kind of portrayed to be this total burnout and everything. And obviously she had some issues going on, but I do not think she was a dumb, ignorant woman. And so even if like Beasley the first night leaked a little bit of information to her, I think she was very susceptible to the power of suggestion and very, say spiritually uneven. They're off kilter. And so these things made her truly think that she was there. And I think that that's how she passed the polygraph, because I think that she really didn't know what she did. And that the more people came after her and started to, just question her and do this, the more information she got. And she probably sat there and just mulled over this nonstop with this horrible addiction problem that she had. And some of the things that I also pondered, and I'm curious to see what y'all think. So, for example, it is interesting that MacDonald just spit out this whole thing about 4 hippies, and that seemingly here's these other 4 people in another part of town, which again, these people were not, this could be just very much a coincidence, but I was like, well, what if MacDonald had spotted her somewhere, and in his mind, he was like, that's who I'm going to use, or what if he had seen her group of friends at the hospital, like, what if he actually had encountered them, none of them knowing each other, and in his mind, he just quickly went with, that's who I'm going to go with, type situation. So, or what if he's telling us true? What if, these people did break into the house and do this? I just find it weird. There's so many things that how much her story changes and how much it goes back and forth. And, maybe she has some guilt about her life choices or something. I don't know. And her intertwinings as far as the informant stuff go, that makes me really second guess things too. So just like the aspect of, when she was on the testifying for the defense, basically, she was homeless during that time, it seems. So what if she was being put up in a hotel room and eating 3 squares a day? I could see, like, okay, sure, I'll say what you want me to say. And then when the push came to shove, well, she doesn't want to go to jail for something she didn't do, or is not sure that she did. And there's times where it seems like she's really helping, and maybe she's high at those times, and maybe other times she's not. So at the end of the day, we can only speculate and guess. And because of the timing of this, I feel like if DNA stuff was available back then and different technologies, this would probably be a clean-cut case. But it just has all these components that make it very speculative, and it can be viewed in many different ways, and so on and so forth. So again, I invite you to do your own research on Helena. Please bring to the table any information you have. Any discussion points are absolutely welcome. I love that. That's what this channel's for. I appreciate if you're still hanging in there with me, and I look forward to talking to you in the live chat about it. Bye.